Good afternoon. I'm Ella Fisher, but most of you know me as Mrs. George Fisher. I was born in Northbridge. I have an older sister and a younger brother. I was born to Mr. and Mrs. Farnham, another name you might recognize. We lived on a large farm in Northbridge. Well, here I am, 20 years old, still not married. My parents had two fears. One, that I was going to be an old maid spinster, or two, that I would marry a poor farm boy from Northbridge. So I can't tell you how thrilled they were when I met Mr. George Fisher. Now, George was 12 years my senior. They were thrilled that I was seeing George. Not only was George wonderful and handsome, he was very wealthy and very successful. Now, you might recognize that name Fisher, as in Fisherville. Fisherville was one of the three villages that today we know as South Grafton. It's Fisherville, Saundersville, and again the name Farnham, as in Farnhamsville. Fisherville ran from where Cross Street is today to where Elmwood Street is, right along Main Street. As I said, George was very successful. Just around the time I met George, his father had made him and his two brothers partners in the mill. Fisher Manufacturing Company, known as Fisherville Mill. They were some of the wealthiest people in town. They had a grand mill, one of the biggest in the area, 3 stories tall, running 160 looms round the clock. And they produced fabric, a terry-type fabric, 1.5 million yards a year. By this time, George and his brothers were some of the wealthiest people in town, but they were also very generous people. They donated the land to build St. James so that their mill workers would have a place to worship. They bought the Victorian next to the land to use as a rectory. They later went on to build a post office and a village market. The mill was in its heyday, 600 employees, when every mill owner's nightmare struck. The mill burned to the ground. That didn't stop the Fishers. They rebuilt the mill, twice as big as it was before, in producing lots of different fabrics, fancy dress fabrics, fancy cottons, as well as the toweling material. This is just about the time George and I got married. They also owned 2 big residences in Fisherville. Their dad actually lived in one of them for a while. They owned 32 tenement houses, but we did not live in Fisherville. My husband built me a grand Queen Anne style home at the end of South Street, overlooking the Common. In order to build our home, they had to take down a large building known as the White Store. Now, my husband, being very interested in architecture and history, actually had some of the wood moldings taken from the old building and built into our new home. Our home was one of the grandest in town. 14 rooms, 10 fireplaces. It was the envy of the townspeople. We had hoped to fill that home with lots and lots of happy children. Unfortunately, we were never blessed with children. So we entertained family and friends. I took care of the house and loved tending my gardens. My gardens were known as exotic back then, although I'm not really quite sure I knew what exotic meant at the time. We entertained. We were very prominent people by this time. People talked of our parties for weeks. We were very happy with the life we built. I running the house, George running the mill. He was actually the agent at the mill by this time. But that happiness wouldn't last long. At the age of 56, George passed away. He had Parkinson's disease. We know it today as Parkinson's disease. Back then, we simply knew it as paralysis. I stayed in the mansion for a while, but it was very lonely without George. The servants were company. I didn't entertain much anymore. So one day, I just packed my bags. And as I said, I had an older sister. She lived in Weymouth. So I packed up and moved to Weymouth to live with my sister. She had lots of children, and there was always company in the house. As for my beloved house, it still stands on the corner of South Street, elegantly overlooking the Common. although today it's offices for professionals. As for George's beloved mill, it ran until the 1930s, employing 700 people, until the Great Depression forced it to close. And then, once again, the mill owner's worst nightmare. The mill was again destroyed by a spectacular fire in 1999.